Hello, welcome again. I'm very happy to be here speaking about agritourism. And this presentation focuses on US and the access to resources for those who are operating in this sector. And so there are two authors related to this presentation. Wei Wei Wang, Center for Rural Studies, University of Vermont, and Lisa Chase from Vermont Tourism Research Center, University of Vermont Extension. So thank you, Wei Wei, and please, your presentation.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Roberta. So again, my name is Wei Wei Wang. I am a research specialist at the Center for Rural Studies. My colleague Lisa Chase is on the line in the audience. Today, we're presenting on data from the U.S. National Agritourism Survey, specifically focused on access to resources for agritourism operators in the United States. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what is agritourism? Agritourism has a long history in Europe and elsewhere in the world. More recently, it's seen a formal recognition in the United States, but there are many conflicting definitions of what agritourism is, which has had implications on research, policy, and services for operators. Chase et al. Developed a conceptual framework, as you can see on the right, for understanding agritourism that breaks up activities in two categories. Core activities, which means specifically on-farm experiences, and peripheral activities on the outside of the circle, focus on off-farm or non-agriculture related activities. The definition for our study that we use is a broad definition of agritourism based on this framework, specifically any activity offered on-farm to visitors and consumers. The data presented here are a component of a 4-state collaboration to better understand the critical success factors of agritourism. And as part of the study, we inquired about the various challenges or barriers to success experienced by operators across the country, which led to the question of what is the accessibility of resources needed by agritourism operations to be successful. Next slide. Before moving into the data, I would like to talk about what I mean by access. I take my definition from Pachansky and Thomas's 1981 framework, in which they define access using 5 dimensions: availability, accessibility, affordability, accommodation, and acceptability. This framework was reworked by Kesby et al. As a framework of access within the food environment, and I've since used that framework to adapt to the dimensions to look at access to resources for agritourism operators. So ideally, access means that all 5 components are in play. And while that's not always the case, we can say that the more dimensions that are covered by a resource, the greater the likelihood for access. Which leads back to my question of what is the accessibility of resources needed by agritourism operations? Next slide, please. So the University of Vermont, the University of California Cooperative Extension, Oregon State University Extension, and West Virginia University comprise the team that collaborated to design an online survey. The survey was designed specifically for current agritourism operators in the US, but it's currently under refinement for international use. The project team used national and local networks and databases to distribute the survey, and all responses were collected prior to the COVID pandemic. My analysis focused on the challenges to success, which included quantitative and open-ended responses on the survey. Next slide, please. In total, we received 1,834 full or partial responses, with at least 1 respondent from each state. The average age of respondents were 55 years old. Over half of the respondents identified as female, and most had a college degree or higher. About 50% of responses came from operators with less than 100 acres of land, so small and medium farms. And most farms operated 50 miles or more from a city of at least 50,000 people. Breaking down the responses by region, most responses came from the Northeast and the Midwest. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges to success for agritourism operations? The biggest challenges for agritourism operations came from a range of concerns. The challenges listed here on the right are by no means comprehensive, but they do reflect the primary concerns of operators. What you see are the challenges that were found to be most statistically significant within the regional analysis. So most of the challenges deal with federal, state, and local regulations, as well as funding sources and community opposition. So now I'll dive into the 3 challenges of focus for today: liability, state and local regulations, and e-connectivity. Next slide, please. So liability impacts the way a farm operates in terms of the activities it can offer. The biggest issue faced across the US was liability. In the US overall, which is the bar on the far left, 81% of respondents felt either very challenged or somewhat challenged by liability issues. Regionally, on the far right, West Coast experienced most challenges, saying that with 33% saying that it was very challenging and 54% saying it was somewhat challenging. Most of the liability issues are the result of issues with visitors and insurance. Operators noted visitor behavior was a major issue, primarily inappropriate behavior due to lack of knowledge about farm and land operations, or general disregard for farm rules, which led to concerns about liability. Given the issue of cash flow and funding, many farms noted their inability to hire according to their need, specifically employers who can handle visitors. All of this is compounded with the problem of insurance. Due to the lack of clarity at the federal, state, and local levels in terms of policy, insurance companies don't always cover the many agritourism activities that are offered on a farm, or it is just generally difficult to get coverage. Problems with insurance can be broken broadly into 2 categories: cost and lack of understanding on the part of the insurer. Many operators noted the high cost of coverage due to all of the on-farm activities that they might hold. One operator wrote in that their yearly income was $5,000, while the insurance policy for their on-farm transport cost $4,000 a year. In terms of coverage, the lack of understanding by insurers, one operator noted insurance is a challenge because most companies don't have a real idea about the actual risk factors or how to write it. Another Western operator also noted that their insurance policy was dropped because they offered both on-farm residency and a Christmas tree operation, which had conflicting policy implications. So this was a general sentiment of many respondents. Much of this also stems from state and local policies, which I'll discuss next. So in terms of accessibility to insurance, from an operator's point of view, there's a lack of appropriate insurance options, and what is available is very costly and does not fit the need or expectations of the operator. Next slide, please. So state and regulations are also barriers to success for operators across the country. Here, as you can see on the graph, the West Coast, 83% of operators find regulations to be a huge challenge. While it is slightly better in other parts of the country, like in the South, where 63% of operators found regulations challenging, it's still a major issue across the country. So state and local regulations impacts everyday operations, including activities offers, and also has an implication on liability. So in some areas, there is a general lack of recognition of agritourism by regulators. This often happens at the local level, and where there is regulation, the rules may differ between state and county laws. There was one Midwest operator who wrote into the survey to ask, from the research I've done, it sounds like the state laws supersede the county laws. Is that correct? And the question is indicative of the problems many operators are experiencing. So we actually asked our Oregon research partner about this question, and her response was sometimes. So it is very difficult to understand the different laws. So where there are regulations, it's often vague, as to which laws actually apply when. Moreover, there isn't a one-stop location to help operators understand what all the laws mean when they do apply. Although agritourism operations can be financially a financially robust part of the local economy, many regulators are uneducated about agritourism, causing confusion among operators as well. Many regulators and government staff do not know or understand rules, which then leads operators to complete multiple certifications that may not actually meet the requirements that they need in order to operate. So this in turn causes extraneous fees for compliance on the part of the operators. So a lot of issues here, and in terms of accessibility, there's an abundance of regulations, but the operators find accessing the rules difficult, the cost of compliance high, and the regulations that are in place do not fit the needs of operators, or that the regulations do not work in the way that the operators had expected them to work. Next slide, please. E-connectivity is an issue for the South and the Midwest, as you can see here. The graph shows 69% of operators in the South and 61% of operators in the Midwest find this a challenge. In the US overall, this issue impacts an average of 61% of operators, meaning it has implications on an operation's ability to market reliably online, run credit card payments for on-farm purchases, offer connection for visitors who might be staying the day or for overnight and extended stays, and in general for farmer education, such as looking up regulations and finding acceptable insurance. One farmer called their need for reasonably priced and reliable service crippling, and that was in the South. So the lack of e-connectivity also particularly has implications in the COVID era of agritourism. Although the survey was conducted pre-COVID, the increased dependence on e-connectivity since March is likely to have increased, making it an even greater challenge for those operators without access. So yesterday, Melanie Palermo mentioned that there's a growing interest in Italy for farm visits as a form of outdoor-based activities. And this is the same in the United States. Americans have also increased their visits to farms this year. And so for farms in the US, this means that not having connectivity to update their farm information, hours, activities, or not being able to accept wireless payment could be a big setback for their operation. So what does this mean for access for e-connectivity? In many locations, e-connectivity is not available or accessible. Where it is accessible, it is often costly and the quality is low. Furthermore, companies do not appear to be making accommodations for the areas where agritourism operations are located. As a Southern operator wrote, the lack of reliable high-speed internet is a huge issue for my own education and also for promotion of our farm and small business. So the lack of available and or affordable e-connectivity services hinders operational growth and has impacts on the finances of agritourism operators. Next slide, please. I also wanted to mention some additional challenges that were mentioned by the operators within the survey. So first, connecting with visitors was difficult for operators, particularly during the season, because they wear so many hats, as one operator wrote. Many operators have to juggle between managing farm production and also tending to guests, which is not always possible. Visitor expectations were also a challenge, according to operators. Many visitors had idealistic expectations of what their farm experience would be, whether it was in terms of the farmer, land, or otherwise, and that might not be met once they actually visit the farm. Operators are also dealing with scale and capacity. Some want to increase the scale of their operation, but due to the lack of resources needed to hire more employees, they're not able to, or they want to downsize either on the production side or the visitor side of the operation, but they thought that the farm might suffer financially if they tried doing that. And finally, the final challenge is infrastructure, which is a big concern, whether that was parking facilities on the farm or road conditions in the local area leading to the farm. Next slide, please. So in the agritourism survey, we also asked operators what types of supports they needed to be successful. And to the right of the screen were the most statistically significant supports selected by operators. These are what they would need in order to be successful. So you can see at the top of the 4 supports, that lead this list: legal and liability information, website management, and zoning regulations, as well as safety information for having on-farm or ranch visitors. Those are in alignment with the three challenges that we discussed today: liability, regulation, and e-connectivity. So it's in alignment with the greatest need of agritourism operators. Next slide, please. So just as a conclusion, as one West Coast operator equipped, this has been one of the hardest jobs and ventures I have ever been involved in, and I make little to nothing to show for all of the effort and work I put into this business. And our data provides a glimpse into that exactly, all of the difficulty of being an agritourism operator in the United States. We've seen that the low levels of accessibility to key resources like insurance, appropriate regulation, and e-connectivity can have a significant impact on farm operations and viability. So without these resources, operators will continue to face challenges to success. And moving forward, it's important that policymakers, service providers, and researchers like ourselves consider all of the dimensions of access as we work with and for agritourism operators. Next slide, please. I just want to take a moment to recognize that this research has been supported by the USDA Critical Agriculture Research and Extension Grant Program, as well as AgMark, and all of our research partners and extension partners across the country. The next slide should be resources, followed by a thank you, and I can take any questions.
We have a question from Melanie. Do some agritourism operators collaborate with the university or other educational institutions that may help in solving some of the challenges that have been illustrated? For example, helping farmers in the management of tourism activity.
Yeah, so the way, I'm not sure of all of the participants on this call, oftentimes, well, in every state, there is a land grant institution, and associated with land grant institutions are extension programs. So these extension programs are meant to assist, some parts of the extension programs are meant to assist farmers with these issues. That said, these extension programs are very limited sometimes. I know in California, I have one colleague who is in the San Francisco area, and she covers 3 counties, which is a very wide region. So let me just read this question. So they do have those offerings, but I think because of the issues that we talked about with e-connectivity and just the amount of time that a farm operator has, they might not be able to access those resources.
Mm-hmm. Another question. Can you talk more about the survey research methods? Are there potential bases in the respondents based on the sampling methods?
Yeah, so our research methods for this particular survey, we use the snowball methods. So what that means is that we created our own database because we're working with a lot of extension agents. They have the contacts to the individuals already. So we sent the surveys to them first and then snowballed from there. So one operator would send to another to send to another. So there are always biases within these methods because it's by selection. So people who are maybe closely tied and have the same points of view, or they self-select because it's an online survey and you can choose not to respond. So there are certainly potential biases with the way that we chose to handle the survey, but it was a balance between various biases. So we selected this method.
Mm-hmm. And what are the action plans that you can develop from the data you presented? So which will be the next step?
So the next step, we're trying to look, Oh, sorry, can you ask me that question again?
Mm-hmm. If from these data, do you plan to have an action plan to help the agritourism,
Oh,
or the public authorities, or the institution that were partners in the project, and so to help the agritourism to develop and to cover the weeks?
yes. So our next step in this grant project is to create those materials to help farmers or operators better understand what resources they need. So that might come in the form of creating those resources, such as information by state of where they can access information about regulations, connecting them to extension agents. And so, for example, webinars that might help explain how they can use these practices that we found that have been successful for other operators. So that will all be part of the next phase of our project.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the possible impacts of COVID on e-connectivity. Do you think COVID might have impacts on some of the other results? Any plans for a post-COVID survey in the US or elsewhere?
Thank you, Lisa. In terms of the plans for a post-COVID survey, I think that our entire team has great interest in having that post-COVID follow-up survey to this, because we want to know how things have changed exactly. I mean, we can speculate as to how they have changed, and there's anecdotal evidence, but I think that there are plans, probably led by Lisa, to look at this information. And then the other question was, do you think COVID might impact the results of the others? Yes, I do, because the COVID will impact liability, which is also, from my point of view, closely tied with state regulations. So state policies in terms of what farms can do, we've seen in California, it is pretty restricted, or at least it was a few months ago, as to what farms could do in terms of opening up themselves and selling vegetables. So for example, in California, I believe that a lot of farmers markets were closed because the state wasn't sure about the food safety component. So that also impacts agritourism and direct sales. So, and then in terms of liability, of course, with visitor expectations, and then the possible issues that stem from that, and whether insurance companies cover operations who are open, I'm sure that has great implications. And I would love to do another survey and to do that analysis.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the major regional differences that you found in this research? Are the differences statistically relevant?
Yeah, so the data that I presented, those are the major regional differences. So for example, on the West Coast, there are a lot of issues surrounding taxes, surrounding local zoning issues, surrounding permits and regulations. So we found that most of this is the regulation issues are heavy on the West Coast. And then across the country, there are other variations. And so what's surprising to me is that New England did not have the most complaints about e-connectivity, because here in Vermont, that's a big issue for our farmers. So the differences are statistically significant, and we will be publishing all of that data in the near future, in other conferences and also in articles.
Okay, I think that we have to close the session. And so thank you very much for your
Thank you so
very
much.
interesting presentation. And we see you, everybody, in just a few minutes in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.